Hello everybody, my name is Leah and today we're going to be talking about wetland distribution changes along the Gulf of Mexico. So before we dig into our data, I just want to give you a little background on the Gulf of Mexico. It is the ninth largest body of water in the world. It provides food, employment, recreation, and natural protection against disasters such as flooding, hurricanes, and oil spills. 40% of our domestic seafood actually comes out of the Gulf of Mexico, so this includes things like shrimp, oysters, and red snapper. It is a critical habitat for sea turtles, shorebirds, and all those different species of shellfish and regular fish that we have talked about. 75% of waterfowl that travel throughout the U.S. actually use the Gulf of Mexico as a migratory stopping point, and this is really essential for ensuring that they get enough rest and recuperation before they finish their journey during the winters. It is also essential for natural gas and oil production. It provides 33% of oil and 20% of natural gas in the country. Another great thing about the Gulf of Mexico is that it's also great for carbon sequestration, which is when the plants are able to hold on to that carbon dioxide and keep it from going into the atmosphere by holding it within their roots underneath the ground. So some of the threats that the Gulf of Mexico is starting to see is just within the last 20th century alone, we've seen half of our coastal marshes were lost. This has to do with human development, loss of barrier islands, erosion, and rising sea levels. Rising sea levels and erosion pretty much go hand in hand. The devastating Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010 affected and decimated 1,100 kilometers of marshes. There's been an increased release of CO2 from marshland loss because, as we said previously, the mangroves and marsh grasses like Spartina alterniflora hold that carbon dioxide within their roots underneath the ground. So as these places are being disturbed, all this is being released out into the air. Some of the human development that really affects the Gulf of Mexico has to do with levees and dams, specifically with the Mississippi River. So previously in history, what would happen is the Mississippi River would flood annually and release sediment back into the grounds to replenish these marshes, and that's not happening anymore due to the levees and dams, which are preventing these floodings. So the Gulf of Mexico is actively losing acreage of land without having any way to replenish that. Another issue with the Gulf of Mexico are we're seeing increasingly mild winters due to climate change, which are promoting mangrove distribution over more herbaceous vegetation like Spartina alterniflora, which is starting to have negative impacts on wildlife, especially for birds, which is something that I tend to study in my spare time. So for this project in our study method, our data was obtained using primarily Google Scholar, USGS, Landsat 7 and 8 imagery, and Google Earth. The data was analyzed and classified using ArcGIS Pro 2.8, and I focused the data collection to the Houma, Louisiana region. So right here, I just went ahead and gave you a map for reference so you can have an idea of what we're going to be looking at. On the left side, you have a map of Louisiana with all of the major cities. Most people don't really know what Houma is, but they understand New Orleans, so we're going to be looking at south of New Orleans. And to the right of that, I have a zoomed in Google Earth imagery of the area that we're going to be looking at today. So on this next tab, I have my Landsat 7 and Landsat 8 imagery. My Landsat 7 was obtained in 2002, and I used a band 321 to keep it looking natural. So you can see in the bottom left corner, there's a lot of islands, pretty well clustered together. You can see Houma's developed area, these more like white, urbanized patches, and you see a good bit of dirt up above. And then you look to the right, and I used my Landsat imagery in bands 421, and this was obtained in 2018. And I really wanted to use this other band so that way you can see the stronger vegetation and you can see the comparison of growth that's going on in 2018. So down in that little cluster of lands from 2002, you can see it's much more sparse. It's orange, which means there's not a lot of healthy vegetation going on. The healthier the vegetation is, the more green it's going to be. So you can definitely see some decay going on. In these barrier islands, though, which is pretty surprising, it has a good bit of red imagery going on. And I believe this has a lot to do with the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan that's going on, which is a restoration project going on for long-term development. Up above, you see a lot of strong vegetation coming in, especially outside of the Houma region. And this is pretty much where we're going to be seeing our mangroves later on. And but you can see closer towards the water, you see a lot of degradation going on. So now we're going to be digging into a little bit more in the actual land coverage distribution and giving you a better idea of what's actually going on in that previous picture. So I have my 2018 and 2002 imagery side by side. You can see all the blue, which is obviously the Gulf of Mexico water. The brown that you're seeing is woody wetlands, which are pretty much the mangroves. And then we have wetlands and herbaceous wetlands that were on the cover distribution. I wasn't sure what they determined was wetland versus herbaceous, so I considered them to be as one. And then in the pink, that's going to be our Houma urban developed area. So in 2002, you see a strong distribution of herbaceous wetlands, which has to do with a lot of like marsh grasses. You see a fair bit of urban distribution coming through, but not very heavy. And you see just little pockets of mangroves. And this is partially due to the fact that mangroves had a stopping point due to salinity and in the climate by winter, but since it's been relatively warm, they've kind of been encroaching up north, as you're starting to see in 2018. You can see a huge increase in the urban population, but as well as you see a massive development of the wooded wetlands. So you're seeing huge pockets of mangrove growth and a pretty striking decrease in herbaceous and general wetland distribution. That being said, I was surprised to see a pretty big pocket of herbaceous wetlands to this middle area, and that could possibly as well be again due to restoration efforts going on in the Gulf of Mexico. So next we're really going to look into the NDVI vegetation analysis. So this is the difference in vegetation growth as compared to Landsat 7 and Landsat 8, so about a 16-year difference. So on the top, you can see the difference in vegetation. This is a difference in between the two models. So any areas that are white is going to have no change, and any areas in red are going to have change. You can see that there's been a pretty much the entire land has changed in some way, save from probably most of these like urban-esque areas. The Gulf of Mexico has been known to be incredibly dynamic. One of the things I did find surprising was all of this green area in Landsat 8, which is a positive because it shows that we're getting wetland growth coming in, but what you're seeing in this green is pretty much all of the mangroves that we were talking about in the previous slide. All of the yellow is some mild growth vegetation coming in. As it gets more red, like these little pockets of water, that means there's no vegetation. But another thing I found interesting is that in the water body that we see from a dark orange to a light orange, which might have to do with algal blooms, plankton, maybe types of seaweed wash up, I'm not too sure. But it is very interesting to see in areas that you would expect to have no vegetation, like on the right side in this little lake over here, that we're still seeing some unusual growth going on. So just to wrap everything up, so we're seeing a lot of wetland distribution in different ways than we have seen in the past, especially with the mangrove increase, while herbaceous wetlands are kind of being pushed to the wayside, especially after these oil spills and aggressive hurricanes the last few years. However, there are rehabilitating and conserving Gulf of Mexico wetland programs, and they're vital for long-term sustainability, especially the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan. The wetlands are amazing because there's benefits for both human and wildlife. Humans have a multi-billion-dollar industry for oil and food and recreation, and that is something we really want to hold on to if we want to keep Louisiana and Texas and Florida viable states. Obviously, there needs to be additional studies to see how these increasing mangroves are going to affect local ecology, especially in the far future with these warmer climate changes and intruding saltwater distributions, as well as how this is going to affect especially the avian migratory patterns. So thank you for coming in and listening to my presentation. These are some of my references. Please let me know if y'all have any suggestions or concerns or anything else that I can answer for you. And y'all have a great holiday.